This is part two of the points video series. It starts with the Middle and Late Archaic periods. If you're interested, part one takes us up to this point that we started with, the Paleo-Indian cultural period, and progressed to this point. Now we'll look at Middle and Late Archaic period. From a cultural standpoint, how do we define these periods? People were getting new sources of food. They were starting to possibly cultivate some forms of food, but at least collecting things like goosefoot, erect knotweed, maygrass, little barley, and sunflower. And a lot of people categorize these foods as the Eastern agricultural complex that the Indians started to develop as food sources. Another thing that sort of exemplifies this period is that in the early archaic period before this, it was mostly open fire roasting. That's the way they used fire. Here, in the Middle and the Late Archaic, they dug pits in the ground and they put food in the pits in water, or they boiled the water, heating rocks in a fire and then dropping the hot rocks in. They also put in food, covered it with leaves, and then put in water, and then heated with hot rocks to have a form of steam baking, if you will. So all of these kinds of different ways of procuring and fixing food started to develop during the Middle and the Late Archaic periods. One of the first Middle Archaic points was the Brannan Point, and it started probably 5500 BC and probably continued for perhaps 2,000 years. It is found throughout Illinois. It has a smaller, it's a side notch point, but it's a smaller side notch point. They have ground bases, and the bases are thinned by removing basal flakes, but it's not in any way, shape, or form fluted. The ground bases are thin, but they're not fluted. The notches are small, but they're not as bold and big as a larger point that we call the Godar Point, which we will look at next. Here's a Godar Point that also starts about 5500 BC and continues for a fairly long time, even into the Late Archaic period. It's starting out, of course, in Middle Archaic, but it goes all the way into the Late Archaic period, as did the Brannan. This is common throughout Illinois. And you look at the size of those notches, it's big and bold. The notches are, it's a side notch point. It's a much bolder point, thicker point altogether. Look at those ears. The ears are square. And a lot of times you see a Godar point that's been resharpened and resharpened down into a drill, and we get what we call the T drill, which is basically like a T, because they remove everything and make it into a drill. But you'll always see that at base and the sides of that the stem, they're ground pretty heavily, usually. But again, these points cover a wide time range, from anywhere from 5500 BC to 2,000 to 3,000 years later into the Late Archaic period. Here's a Benton Point, and these are Middle Archaic, and they were made for about 1,000-year period from 4,800 to 3,800 BC. They're strictly a Middle Archaic point, and they are a Southern Illinois point. They're fairly specific to Southern Illinois, although you'll find them up further north. They can be very large. I've seen some up to 10 inches in length. They have broad, shallow side notches with a slightly expanding base. Being found in Southern Illinois, they're usually out of Southern Illinois cherts, or cherts that you find points made out of in Southern Illinois, like Sonora. They're made out of Sonora, Dover, Codman, Dongola, Mounds gravel, classic Southern Illinois cherts. Here's probably my favorite point type, the table rock. It goes from as early as 4,800 BC to 2000 BC, so it's obviously a Middle and a Late Archaic point, both into both cultural periods. To me, table rocks are a study in grace. You have to handle them. I mean, they're just so graceful. They're a vase-shaped point. The stem is heavily ground. The sharp edges of the stem are ground down, and the bases are ground down to sometimes almost that hafting area almost becomes rounded. It's found throughout Illinois. It's found in all kinds of habitats, 2 to 3 inches in length. They tend to be smaller, the ones we find in my neck of the woods in eastern Illinois, than the ones you find in west central Illinois. And sometimes the smallest ones can be confused with Mirims, which is a smaller point, and it is also at one of the Riverton points. The stems of the table rocks are completely ground. With the Mirims, if there's any grinding at all, you'll just see it lightly ground on the base, and a lot of times they're not even ground there. Table rocks are made of high quality cherts. A lot of them are made out of heat-treated Burlington. The texture of the surface is very slick, and it develops a reddish cast a lot of times. You usually think of Burlington as being creamy white or white, but when you heat treat Burlington, it often develops not only a slicker surface, but a reddish cast. The chert is heat treated before the flaking occurs, and the reason they do heat treating is because it makes the chert flake more easily, and it just makes a better point. The table rocks are made out of usually very high quality cherts. You find a really nice heat-treated Burlington table rock chert. They're just beautiful. They're vase shaped. They're absolutely something to behold. Here's a sort of a southern Illinois point mostly, although you'll find them elsewhere. It's the Karnak. They come in two different variations. The stemmed, which we have here, you can see just a very slight indication of shoulders there, but some of them are unstemmed, and there's no shoulders prevailing there. It's just a straight point, an unstemmed point. They're found mostly in southern Illinois and in western Illinois, 2 to 5 inches in length. They're thick and they're bullet-shaped, somewhat similar to Matanzas points, which we'll also talk about. The halves are usually lightly ground, and they use a lot of Burlington and Salem cherts that were heat-treated. But they're a sort of a bullet-shaped point, and they're kind of thick. If you're in southern Illinois or western Illinois, they're fairly common. You get over into eastern or northern Illinois, you'd be unlikely to find these Karnak points. Here's a Matanzas point. Again, they tend to be bullet-shaped. You see that they're more of a very shallow, long side notch type of point. 4,500 to 3,100 BC, so they dip into not only start in the middle Archaic, but go into the late Archaic. They're found in most sections of Illinois. They tend to be narrow. Again, they are thick and bullet-shaped, like the Karnaks, and they're thought to be related to the Karnaks. Use a lot of Burlington chert to make them, and heat-treated Burlington as well. Some you'll find out of Salem, Kincaid, and Cobden, Dongola, cherts from southern Illinois. Here is a McLean Helton point that's probably dated to the early part of the late Archaic, probably 3,500 to 2,500 BC. They're primarily a southern Illinois point. They're a robust, expanding stem point, 1.5 to 2.5 inches in length. Basal grinding is rare. These points are sometimes very thick. They do have prominent shoulders, and sometimes they are barbed. Here is a Ledbetter Mule Road late Archaic point dating from probably 3,500 to 1,200 BC. And this particular example is made out of kaolin, which is a southern Illinois, southwestern Illinois chert, which you find projectile points in southwestern Illinois and southern Illinois made out of kaolin. They usually have a contracting stem, and if you look at that stem, you see that it contracts, but yet, for the most part, the base is sort of squared off. They vary quite a bit in length, from 2 to even up to 8 inches in length. The Mule Road Ledbetter points are found basically in southern Illinois, and they're very rare as you go further north. Some of them are very well made. They tend to be sort of on the crude side, but I've seen some that are really, really well made. The best examples are made out of a high-quality kaolin that chips well. Here's an Osceola point. It's a late Archaic type from 3,400 to 2,600 BC. It's mostly a northern and western Illinois point, but it's found elsewhere in the state. It is a very well-made side-notch point, anywhere from 2 to 6 inches in length. It's often confused with the much older Graham Cave Point, which is in the early Archaic period. This point differs from the Graham Cave. The Graham Cave has more distinct ears and flaking. Very rarely will you find an Osceola point that is pressure flaked. Some of the Graham Caves are. Most of the flaking on Osceola points is percussion flaking. They have these long parallel sides and a very nice atlat point. But again, they are late Archaic and not early Archaic. Here's a point type, the Etley, that's a late Archaic point, 2800 to 2500 BC, that's most common in southwestern Illinois. Rarely do you find them outside of that area. They're a large point, commonly 4 to 7 inches in length, but they do go up to 10 inches in length. Most are made out of high-quality cherts, such as Crescent Quarry, Burlington, Fernglen, sometimes Burlington that has been heat-treated. They're a very large point. For a big point, a large point, they're very well made, but they're pretty regional. Here's a Sedalia point, and they are late Archaic, 2600 to 2100 BC. They're a long, narrow point. Some of them are fairly thick in the midrib, 4 to 7 inches in length, have a thick cross-section usually. They tend to be a western Illinois point, although I found a really nice one out of Burlington in the Wabash drainage. And some have been found in the Kaskaskia drainage too, up in central Illinois. For the most part, Burlington chert was the chert most often used. Here's a Tremble Point, and these are one of the what I classed as the Riverton points. 2000 to 1000 BC, these are late Archaic. They're small, and when you find them, and when I was first finding these on the edges of marshes, along with Mirim points, they were very small points, so I thought, well, gee, are these points used with a bow and arrow? But they're very thick. These are actually atlat or dart points, and there's a lot of theories on why they were thick. One of them is they were used probably, among other things, used for hunting waterfowl, and they were used on trident spears. So if you're using a trident spear with a small point, you still have to have some weight there. So they made them maybe thicker so they could get some extra weight in the point, so they had some weight on the front end of that spear. That's what I think is the reason for the thickness. Other people may have other reasons, but that's how I reason the thickness. Remember, they're very thick. Sometimes they're very well made, actually. They're side-notched, and you notice these notches are coming in from the side. They're closely related to the Mirim Point, which we will show next. But they're both used by the Riverton culture that was actually based in the Wabash River Valley of Illinois and Indiana. They're scattered elsewhere in the state, especially in the headwater wetlands and the prairie. Even though they're thick, they're very well made. Here is the Mirim Point. It is also a Riverton culture point. It's possibly a little later than the Tremble by 200 years. It's still a late Archaic point, going from 1800 to 1000 BC. And these points are corner notched as opposed to side notched. And sometimes you cannot tell the difference between a Tremble and a Mirim point. Mirim points tend to be a little broader, but they're the same culture. And they're very closely related to the Tremble point. They're generally wider, they're very thick, but often very, very well made. This particular one was made out of jasper, of all things. Some of the Trembles and Mirims are very hard to tell apart, and they just one grades right into the other, and there really no discernible differences. But it's that small size, very well made points that are very thick. That's the diagnostic features of these Riverton points, these Mirims and Trembles. Here we have a Morse knife, and I just show that here because a lot of you in western Illinois run into this along the larger rivers. It's what we call the terminal late Archaic, the very last part of the late Archaic into the early woodland period from probably 1500 BC to 800 BC. And you notice this handle at the basal end. I mean, you can see there just where a handle has been formed. They're medium to large handled knives, anywhere from 5-6 inches long up to 14 inches in length. They're usually made out of heat-treated Burlington. They're found in Illinois and the surrounding states. They're usually thin and very well made. When you think of Morse knives, you usually think of Illinois River, also the Mississippi River. That's the context in which you find them. Here's a knife that everybody knows, a turkey tail knife. They come in actually 3 different styles. You have the Fulton style, which is shown here, the Hebron style, and the Harrison style. And they are late archaic into the early woodland period, 1500 to 400 BC. A lot of times they're found in caches, most always found in caches. A lot of times they're covered in red ochre. They're very thin, very well made, 4 to 8 inches in length. They're most always made out of Wyandotte, Sonora, or Cobden, Dongola chert. They are never made out of Burlington. If you have somebody has a turkey tail that's made out of Burlington, be very doubtful of its authenticity. It's either that or he is the first person, he or she is the first person to ever have one made out of Burlington. They're very thin, very well made. They're often killed intentionally, that is, they are broken and covered in red ochre. Some that are buried in caches are not broken, but a lot of them are. You find them throughout Illinois. We have a hot spot of them into Iroquois and Kankakee counties on into Indiana around the Kankakee Sands ecosystem. For some reason, there are a lot of turkey tail caches that have been buried there. I know of 11 caches that have been found in that greater Kankakee Sands area. Another blade of the terminal late archaic into early woodland period, 1500 to 100 BC, is the red ochre blade, often found in caches, often covered with red ochre, made almost exclusively of white Burlington chert. The interesting thing, if you look in the book, there's one made out of Platteville galena, was found along the Sangamon, a river just north of the East Bend Mennonite Church, that a person handed to me, and it's a very unusual one because it's made out of Platteville galena. They're thin, they're very well made, found throughout Illinois, 3 to 6 inches in length. The one pictured here, I think, was found in a cache of, 10 over in the Spoon River country in Fulton County. And they're, like I said, they're often covered in red ochre. Here's a Mopac point that again is terminal late archaic, going from 1400 to 800 BC. They're small points, 3/4 of an inch to 2 inches in length. They're very well made, often heat treated. They're straight to slightly expanding stems on them. They're most often barbed, as is this one, and the shoulders are usually very distinct. They're most common in southwestern Illinois, but they can be found elsewhere in the state. They are one of many of these late archaic straight-stemmed point types. And this one, of all things, is made out of Upper Mercer chert, which is a chert that is found east of our place, in another state. You always have to go out and look because you never know what you're going to find, and it may not fit the mold. It may be completely unique to your area. So my advice is every chance you get, you go out and you look like I do. Here's a Campbellsville barb point. It's late archaic, 1300 to 800 BC. It's another one of those straight-stemmed late archaic point types. 2 to 5 inches in length. Has sharply downturned barbs. That's the distinctive feature. They're very well made. The stems are short compared to another very closely related point you find in southern Illinois called the Buck Creek Point. Campbellsville barbed points are centered in the lower Illinois River Valley, although I found them in east central Illinois. Heat-treated Burlington was a favorite material, although I did find one out of Wyandotte, which is rare, but just look at that one that's made out of Wyandotte. Very, very well made. Here we have the Motley points. They're a terminal late archaic point, 1300 to 800 BC. They're a small to medium-sized point. The distinguishing feature here is they have these wide, deep, arching notches, and they're barbed. The shoulders go out and they're barbed. The neck of the stem is often very narrow, and it's narrow because these deep, widening arches go way in. The most common in southern Illinois, but you can find them throughout the state. Here's a heartbreak. This is a Black Creek willow blade, 1200 to 600 BC. They're the terminal late archaic into the early woodland period. They're a large leaf-shaped blade, 4 to 9 inches in length, and they're a cache blade for the most part. Very rarely do you find singles. As many as 600 of these have been buried in a cache in Illinois. They're made out of Wyandotte, and some are made also out of Cobden d'Angola. They're usually thin and very well made. You can find them sometimes with red ochre coated on them. The reason I said this one was a heartbreak is because that was found just 100 yards back of one of my sites by a friend. Now we go into the early and middle woodland periods. It's the start of pottery making, and that's one of the hallmarks of the early woodland period. And the pottery they made was Mirim thick, which was very thick pottery, and they progressed from there. And it's also, in the middle woodland period, it's the rise of the Hopewell culture, which had very artistic stoneworks and pottery works and that sort of thing. And it's also the start of very intensive gardening and farming operations. The first point we show here from the early woodland period is a Kramer Point, and it's from 800 to 400 BC. These are medium-sized points from 2 to 3 inches in length. These points are closely associated with the first crude, thick Mirim pottery. On one site that I found Mirim pottery, I found upwards of 60 these Kramer Points. Some were broken, some were whole. So there's a very close association between Kramer Points and Mirim thick pottery. They're found throughout Illinois. They're very distinctive point. They have a square stem with moderate to heavy grinding on the sides of that stem, and the base is ground. For some reason, the people that started making pottery also made this point. Here we have an early to middle woodland period point, the Edina Wabisa. It goes under both names. We use Edina Wabisa together, or the Wabisa. That nomenclature is used more in Wisconsin, where this point is also found. Early to middle woodland, 600 BC to AD 150. Here again, collectors have their own pet name for this point. They call them beaver tails, and you can see why. It has a very distinct, well-rounded stem, and also the shoulders tend to be distinct and well-rounded. You should remember the haft end of this point well, because it can be confused somewhat with a point that was almost made at the same time, and we'll talk about that one just here later. These Edina Wabisas are found throughout Illinois. They're beautiful points, and look at the color of the one on your right there. Look at that heat treatment of Burlington. Look at the colors. That piece of Burlington was white before the heat treatment was applied, before that point was chipped out. A heat-treated piece of Burlington as a blank. But remember that oval, rounded stem. Here is a point that is closely related to the Edina Wabisas, and a lot of times people call them Robbins Edinas. But remember that the Robbins point has a square stem and more distinct shoulders. This is also an early to middle woodland point that dates maybe just a little bit later than the Edina Wabisas, maybe 500 to 100 BC for the Robbins point. But again, they are distinct from the Edina Wabisas. They're most prevalent on the eastern side of Illinois. They're concentrated really in Indiana and Ohio. You can find them throughout Illinois, but there seems to be a concentration along the eastern part of Illinois in the drainages that drain to the east. Although in northeastern Iowa and the adjoining counties just across the river in Illinois, there's a fair number of Robbins points found there also. Here's a Dixon broadblade point. Again, it's early and middle woodland, 500 BC to AD 150 maybe, so a little later into the middle woodland culture than the previous 2 points. It's a medium to large point. It's found throughout Illinois. Has a large contracting stem. It's a spear point or a knife, obviously. Has these very broad shoulders. And the blade is widest at the shoulders. It's often very thin and very well made. There is one of these, and it's pictured in the book, the big one, that the Gilcrease Institute has that was found up around Rock Island. And it's so thin, you think you could blow smoke through it. Actually, you can see all the light all the way through it. It's an incredible piece. I was afraid to pick it up to photograph it. I was afraid I would drop it. It was just like a leaf. It was just unreal. I don't know how in the world they could nap something that well. Here is probably the most recognized point type of any point type, and that is the Sniders Point. And there is a group of points called the Sniders Cluster that are very closely related. But we will talk just briefly about the Sniders Point itself. 150 BC to AD 200. It's the classic, iconic point style of the Middle Woodland period. It's probably, as I said before, the most recognized of all the point types. It is heart-shaped. It's the point with these deep, broad notches and an expanding stem. You look at a Sniders Point, and you can see why it's closely related to 3 other point types that are included in this cluster, and those being the Manker, the Gibson, and the Norton that followed it. But many theories on why they made these points this shape. The Hopewell cult was really in love with birds, and they depicted birds on their artwork, and a lot of people believe that the Sniders Point depicts a bird in flight. And this bird symbolism was thought to drive a lot of aspects of this culture. And we see the bird symbolism on the platform pipes they made in the log tomb burials. And these platform pipes were often depicting ravens and crows. Something about birds that the Hopewell cult really zeroed in on, and we think that the Sniders Points are a reflection of that. These occur throughout Illinois and parts of the Midwest. They're somewhat smaller in size in the eastern part of the state than they are in their classic Illinois River home, where they were discovered along the Sniders site and all of those Middle Woodland and Hopewell sites that Gregory Perino did a lot of excavation in early on in his life. Here is another of the Sniders cluster. It is a Manker, 150 BC to AD 400. It's a little later, probably made a little later on than the Sniders. The Sniders probably ended about AD 200. This went on for a couple of hundred years longer. It is obviously a Middle Woodland point. The example I have here is possibly a little crudely made for a Manker point, because some of the Mankers are so well made that they're very similar to a Sniders. They're almost indistinguishable. Take a look at the different Mankers and Sniders that are illustrated in the book, and you'll get a little bit of a clue as to what the minor differences are. Generally, they're not as artistically made, but some are almost indistinguishable from the Sniders. Some have equated the Manker as a poor man's Sniders. It's found throughout Illinois. Here's another example of the Sniders cluster, the Gibson Point. And it's just a tad later, starts AD 50 to 400. It's a little later than the Sniders and the Manker. But it is definitely one of these Middle Woodland points. You look at the style of the notches. They're most common in the lower Illinois River Valley. They're fairly rare. They are longer and narrower than most of the Sniders cluster points. The notches are smaller, and they're more side-notched. If you look at it, the notches seem like they migrate up the sides of the point a little bit. If you look, the bases extend out almost as wide as the ears. That's usually a clue that it could be a Gibson point. They are over a fairly wide area, but they're very rare outside the lower Illinois River Valley. The last of the Sniders cluster is the Norton Point, which is obviously middle woodland, 80-50 to 400. It's the last of the Sniders cluster. Like the Gibson, it tends to be a narrower point overall. The notches are not as bold as the notches in the Sniders or a Manker, and it's another one of the least common of this cluster of points. They differ from the Gibson in that the base does not extend out nearly as wide as the shoulders. And some people will look at that and say, well, that's a Sniders point. But no, it's probably, the notches are well made and all of that, but it's a little bit longer, more of a lancelet shaped point. Sniders tend to be more heart-shaped. But I can tell you, there are points that you get all kinds of debates on whether, oh, that's a Sniders. No, that's a Norton. So, you know, I mean, even the experts, they argue ad infinitum on these point types.